All right, Joel. Perfect.
Hi,
All
sorry.
right.
My teammates just wanted to ask if they were audible from the other computer.
I when did they speak? Sorry.
Oh, I think their
Oh,
mic isn't
okay.
working.
Yes, I think I heard them just now. If they could speak again one more time.
Hello, are we audible now?
Great. All right. And just
All
to
right.
confirm, we are doing the motion about the three cities approach, the first motion. Begin the debate. Here.
All right. Just confirming again that I'm audible and visible.
Yep. Yes, you are.
Okay. Hold on. I just need to double check my audio. I think there was a weird. Okay, yeah, should be fine now. All right. Pulling up my timer. Wait, I think I'm experiencing another tech difficulty. Riv. Never mind. It's working now. The split screen was being weird. Okay. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. When it comes to development and quality of life, connectivity will only get you so far. Let's clarify the burden in this debate. Both sides assume. So the question of this debate is how to best develop the peripheries to get, firstly, economic growth, secondly, quality of life for as many citizens as possible. We on AF think that if we invest in them, we can successfully develop all of them. But also, the question of this debate is secondarily, how do we maintain the stability and success of large cities? Because we need to acknowledge that peripheries can be a detriment to the true city center. And we see this in the Philippines, where gentrified Manila is so developed, all roads lead to it. It has itself has itself to because of collapse due to congestion, right? And we think that this is because of CBD, where you're pretty much incentivizing everyone from the provinces to come into the center. What then is our stance and model on our side? We would say that the three cities approach represents a genuine attempt by the national government to invest in the peripheries of major cities. So they will offer contracts to major firms to set up businesses, factories, and quality of life infrastructure. Things like hospitals, malls, the whole works, right, essentially. So this will come with competitive tax rates and like other incentives to help boost up the growth of these places. This also looks like putting up schools and scholarship opportunities for experts to move there and work in whatever competitive firms are entering. So it's important to clarify that we can create separate hubs and that can generate huge amounts of growth and revenue, right? So we will still connect the three cities with infrastructure, clearly, but it's not going to be the main focus of our economic development or of our resources. So this looks like the New York model with Brooklyn, Queens and Manhattan, or the North Carolina Research Triangle with Raleigh, Durham, and Chapel Hill, or even like the triple South African capital model of Johannesburg, Pretoria, and Cape Town. So we oppose megacities on neg, like things like Shanghai, Beijing, Tokyo, Hong Kong, Seoul, Lagos, simply because these cities often drown out chances for growth, promote squalor working conditions, and forces labor to move from far-flung areas just to be able to get a chance at minimum wage. First argument then, why the three city models is the better for economic growth. Quite simply, we would say that it's important to note that when we're talking about the investment, it's likely to be split to building multiple, like these three cities, like concurrently, but obviously with some type of strategy behind it. So therefore, the first level is, we would say there's massive private buy-in for development of the peripheries. So as long as there's government finesses the planning of it. Simply, first of all, we would say city centers attract a lot of attention and competition to live in them and invest in them, because everyone wants to move to cities, be employed there, and access all the quality of life institutions they can, right? That you can associate with modernity, good schools, good hospitals, and offices. But also companies would want to get a share of this market simply because you have a lot of a lot of growth that is possible if you are one of the first movers in, right? But secondly, you would say when the city centers get full because of the massive demand, people and investors flock to the next best alternatives. So when people run out of condos or jobs or don't want to deal with traffic and hyper competition, they'll want to move to a more suburban area that still has posh amenities, but just want to compete over land prices, rent prices, salaries, market share, etc. in the main city. So they'd want to chase the market that they can't get into the city that is a lot more cost effective, where they would still have the benefit of being the first mover in. They'd want to capitalize on that advantage, right? Cheap land, cheap labor. But at the same time, you would say that the corporations will keep the quality of services high because of the competition at the point in which you are also going to build this into a city, right? The fact that other peripheries are developing with their own private firms means that if they don't want their middle class market to move somewhere else, they need to be good. Second level on economic growth is simply that peripheries can have their own market niche for holistic economic development. And holistic development looks like making 3 cities and countries as a whole a lot more self-sufficient, because we allow each city to develop its own niche, instead of just one city focusing on just one area of expertise, right? So for example, you have the split of levels of government in South African capital, which is Johannesburg for the executive branch, Pretoria for the judiciary, Cape Town for the legislation, right? But also the North Carolina research triangle, that you have science versus business versus and science and a business hub there in this little triangle. So each city has its own unique selling point, drawing various amounts of development across each area, simply again for 3 reasons. One, because you're able to give them some type of specialization that each city can focus on and fully invest on, versus with mega cities where you only have one, or you have to split the resources a lot. And secondly, we would say that this is where second reason is simply because we have corporate buy-in, but third, because we would say that spreads out development and ultimately improves quality of life. This is the highest impact argument in the round, because economic development is a prerequisite for the sustainability of growth and for the second thing we're going to discuss, which is the improvement of quality of life. So that's the second argument, how we improve quality of life. First level, we are able to spread out development simply because the end result is we optimize quality of living. Because when you are able to build multiple or 3 cities that are peripheral to each other, this is where, aside from the competition, you have things like in tourism, the unique niche to go to each city that people would want to visit. In transportation, you have roads that are not cramped, subway passengers that are not locked in sardines every morning because you are spreading out the population, or that people have more options to go to simply. But you also have the more efficient movement of goods and services, or more efficient supply chains overall, because each city gets to specialize as well, and probably they could also contribute to the infrastructure for transportation. But very simply, right? More cities equals more shit to go around. You have more job opportunities and more choices, essentially, with 3 different main large cities. You have more education opportunities. You could probably apply to more universities, or you could probably move somewhere that is more proximate to you, but it's still a good opportunity as well. And this is important because in next world, maybe you can expand the mega city slowly, but it doesn't solve the problems of things like congestion. It doesn't solve the problems like making people move very far away just for them to be able to live a good life in the city. Let's clarify then what it looks like on the CBD model on their side. Then this is where we're going to directly preempt a lot of what they might say. They might say that they can still spread out development by creating multiple CBDs further apart in the country. Again, we'd say one, this debate is about the peripheries, so you're still going to ignore the people in the peripheries. Secondly, they still put the burden for people to uproot their lives to be proximate, but people are still disadvantaged. And know that this is only proximate. They are not assured these opportunities, right? These people don't come from these same elite schools. They don't have the same connections and support systems in this new life, even if you're able to make it easier for these people to physically move, right? That they're less familiar with the culture and ways of that megacity. But secondly, these individuals are put in a more competitive world, but were never given the equipment to compete. Their competition probably has more connections, was raised to navigate themselves in these cities, etc. It's not about the ability to go there, but how they can effectively uplift their lives there given these social opportunities that they were given from the start, right? So we say that this proves that even if the CBD model does have development, it's not one that most can access. But let's be next level then is on having different niches that eases reliance on megacities. Even in CBD success stories like Shanghai and Shenzhen, where there are booming tech industries, the over-reliance on these hubs can bring the country down to the point at which these urban hubs become the sole focus of the country, which is the point in which the rural and peripheral individuals suffer en masse. But more importantly, this makes it less likely for megacities to collapse, incentivizing everyone to come in and everyone to move in, with over-congestion making it far harder for unskilled labor. But lastly, on the principle, we'd say on their side, they force people to move if they want good opportunities, where you put a high burden for them to even afford it when they're already disadvantaged in the first place. We would say this: in our world, we are able to mitigate the large inequality like
Hi, sorry. I missed out the last few seconds of the last few seconds of the first F speech. Could we just let the first F finish the part on, I guess, the in principle displacing people bad argument?
Sorry, what do you mean about missing the last few seconds?
I dropped
Was there-
from the call.
Right. Okay. All right. Maybe just a quick one-sentence summary. I will note that it did go a little bit over 8:30, the end of the sentence. So I think
Okay, yeah,
don't
sure.
indulge too much. But yeah, maybe just a quick, as I said, one sentence about the principle.
okay, wait, let me just check my notes. Okay, okay. We would say that in principle, this is far worse in the CBD model, simply because you have a high burden for these people to even afford these opportunities, versus in our world, where you were able to make these slightly more proximate to them, have it built it like closer to home, which means that they are far less likely to face a lot of these structures that we say they are going to struggle with in the world of CBD.
Okay, thank you for that very concise summary. I now invite first Negative to begin their team's case.
Hey, can I be heard?
Yep, you're audible.
Great. Just one moment.
I'm just going to change the lighting.
Okay. 1 second. Just fixing some of that setup. Great. Okay. I'm about to get started. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. Cities are richer than towns. Big cities are richer than small cities. And the question in this debate is, do we better integrate the periphery of a large city into the city so the city overall becomes larger, or do we try and keep them out and establish smaller cities in its orbit, which we will prove will be far less effective at getting the things for the people we want to help? The first thing I'll do in this speech is just provide a brief point of setup, just contrasting the approaches from two teams. Then I'll make two arguments. The first argument I'll make will be about the labor markets in these cities, which is probably the most important argument in the debate. And then I'll move on to explain why we get better infrastructure on our side, which should also be a debate-winning benefit for us. Firstly, then, onto the setup. This debate obviously presupposes a pretty clear trade-off, which is to say resources are kind of fixed under both sides. What Affirmative wants to do is not create extensive public transport networks between the periphery and all other parts of the city and the center. They instead want to encourage people to live near where they work and try and use public investment to get people to stay in the periphery. Side Negative, however, just wants people to be able to get to work, wherever that work happens to be, wherever they live, where they happen to live in the city, just to make it easy for people to get to work, integrate movement across the city in the fastest way possible so that regardless of where you live, you can access a job quite easily. So, firstly, let's move on to the point about labor markets. There are kind of two pieces of context to this point. The first piece of context is obviously the most important question in the debate is the average city is in a developing country where the priority of the people within that city is to get a job and to have that quality of that job be high and not one that is terrible. If we can prove we get more people employed and they get better jobs, we obviously take the round because the quality of your job and having income are the primary determinants of your quality of life. The second piece of context here is just we want to be quite explicit, which is to say, under their side, they obviously prefer a world where you have kind of like distinct labor markets on the periphery of the city, whereas we would prefer one very large labor market and integrating people into that labor market. Why is that latter approach a superior one? There are kind of four reasons for this. The first is to do with the idea of agglomeration, which is to say, when you bring lots of people together, lots of talented people together, there tends to be a tremendous amount of innovation and spillover effects. So we point to Shenzhen, we point to Silicon Valley in New York, all of which have a tremendous hubs of innovation and value creation and productivity because you have lots of talented people intermingling and being in the same place, working in the same firms or working in different firms or just hanging out, etc. The second kind of key idea is you just get far access to larger economies of scale in terms of labor, which is to say it's far more viable and far more exciting for companies to move to a place where there's a lot of different types of labor possible and where they're not labor constrained, and importantly, the larger a city is and the better integrated that city's labor market is to, it is easier it is to get around the city and travel from one area to another, the more likely you're able to have that. The key example here, just to prime your intuitions, is to think about why Amazon, when they're announcing their second big headquarters, could have picked any city in the US. They were all offering enormous tax breaks to try and get Amazon. But instead of following the logic of the affirmative team and picking a place which was small, where land was cheap, and didn't have to compete very much for workers, they picked New York City. And the reason they picked that for their next headquarters is because that's where all their workers wanted to live. It was where they wanted to invest. And this is really crucial because their entire understanding inside affirmatives, of how businesses choose to make investments is totally backwards. And businesses don't choose to make investments based on like slightly more advantageous tax policy or better things there. They choose to make investments based on a medium-term assessment of what they need. Typically, businesses are talent constrained. They need lots of workers. They want lots of ability to switch between workers and match between workers and jobs. When people are separated out, when they're living in the periphery, businesses are not going to want to work there because there are not many workers who live in those places. They are not easily integrated, etc. The third reason as to why larger labor markets or a single large labor market is preferable to like 3 or 4 very small ones is because you get lots of specialization. The more people that are connected and part of the labor market, they can specialize in particular things, they can earn more, which is to say, that's why large cities that are well connected have a tremendous amount of variety in the different services that are on offer. The fourth and maybe the most powerful reason is to do with mobility, which is to say, most people, especially people on the lower end of the labor market, change jobs a lot. They move around, they want to mix and match. In fact, we would point out this is crucial, not only like a fundamental right that people have, but crucial to workers' bargaining power because they can easily take another job somewhere else if their current job isn't good, and that forces businesses to over time improve conditions, improve wages. And I guess the key question to ask here when weighing this material is, why would people be on the periphery of the city in the first place? It's because they've moved to that city, they're trying to get into that city and get access to the jobs and opportunities within that particular place. Side negative say you should stay, or side affirmative say you should stay in the periphery and hope these government programs eventually deliver a return. We say, let's get you connected to the rest of the city so you can take advantage of those opportunities. And this is important, right? Because we would point to South Africa as exactly the kind of failure mode that this side affirmative engages in, because they did try and build these kind of urban satellite cities around bigger cities. And what happened? It was very hard for people to get into the city and travel between them. So anytime they tried to get a job in another place, it was a nightmare and they had to try and drive. It was very hard. But secondly, businesses didn't want to invest there because there were these satellite cities without lots of amenities, not the nice inner city. And finally, right, there was a tremendous amount of people things quickly spiraled out of control. These cities started economically failing, which brought about tremendous levels of social dysfunction as well. The problem with this other approach, markets love to centralize and grow bigger and more productive. This side tries to use government policy to try and prevent that. It doesn't work. And what happens is people are trapped in these areas with very high unemployment, very low levels of business investment, and limited opportunities to leave. They are stuck there. It is incredibly, incredibly bad. The impact of this argument is one, our labor market is likely to be far more productive and produce a tremendous amount of more value. That is important because one, productive workers get paid more, so people earn more, but two, there's a better job and more jobs, better quality of life, and the labour market failure they want not only leave people worse off in real terms directly, but also means that the tax revenues, the sort of infrastructure in each of these satellite cities is tied to the tax revenue gained from each of those small cities, right? Like the tax revenue of your local area is tied to your income there. If there aren't many jobs and income wages are low and companies suppress wages because they know it's very hard for you to move from that city to another city, right? Obviously, these people are going to be far worse off. Next then, infrastructure and amenities. The context for this point is just pointed that both sides obviously want people to enjoy a better quality of life and enjoy all the hospitals and better roads and things that bring that. Why is our side better? One, we avoid duplication because a centralized city means you can build things like in the center and allow people to get access to it very simply. Think about how most cities are going to probably have at most one airport and how hard it would be for you to get from a satellite city without extensive public transport networks between that satellite city and the airport in the center. On the comparative, we allow people to access that far easier. It's obviously also preferable for people to like not have to rebuild basic functions of the city in different places. It's far better to have like one bit of the city in the center where all the government buildings and districts are. If you need to go and see a court or whatever, you can access that. Onto their side, you have to try and build different courthouses in different places. You're spending a tremendous amount of money. And also because the labor market has failed, you don't actually have the ability to spend that in the long run. You have less money. The impact at this point is one, we get better infrastructure that is less public purse, far more efficient, and that has a set of, and that is quite important. But secondly, because they don't, by definition, under their side, invest in good public transport between places, in order to get from a satellite city to another satellite city or to the center, because there's no public transport, you have to drive, which is why Brasilia, which tried to do this, has awful traffic problems and a very high level of road debt. People driving everywhere leads to air pollution, which kills and is significantly worse for the climate. These cities don't work because cities aren't buildings that can be planned out and put in these places. They're organisms which need to be allowed to thrive and grow internally. Support side.
I thank first negative for that speech. I now invite second affirmative to continue their team's case. Here.
Yeah, I'll do my best also to stop as soon as possible if anyone drops. Yeah. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. All of the problems that first negative points out as to why no one wants to move to peripheries is because of the lack of urban planning around them. The fact that when you say that laborers don't want to move to these areas because they're slums, it's simply a problem of initial investment by the government to create opportunities for them to be there, to create the competitive housing using the capital that you already have from the city center, because this is a long-term debate, right? The fact that you already have a city center that is flourishing means that this is a question of how the peripheries can be used to sustain this development as much as possible. And so that is why all we need is government investment to attract investors, like to attract people to live there, experts who want to live there because of a good quality of life, but also for a good corporate sector with the respective tax incentives, with the respective sources of laborers who will be able to develop that area as a business hub or a technology hub or a hub innovation in its own right? Listen to all of the problems that they have, right? Obviously, all like laborers want to go to the city supposedly to have a better quality of life there. But if you are able to, like, you never weigh this against our existing contentions. The fact that cities simply get full because of the massive demand of how many people want to live there and work there, because of the fact that in terms of corporations, the competition also becomes too intensive in terms of land prices, in terms of office spaces and the salaries that they have to pay for these people. And so all of these people will have to who already moved to the city with dreams perhaps of like making it big there, or corporations who are trying to set up their business model in the area will obviously be compelled to move to these peripheries so long as the conditions are perfect there for the same kind of development. And we see no reason as to why that is not the case. This is what happened with New York City, in which obviously the capital was obviously extremely like saturated with all of this competition. It was the initial investment in the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens that actually led to the sustainable development of different niches within that country, that area's economy and like better quality of life for everybody involved. There's also the extraneous benefit of simply helping more people. Let's look at the best case that they have on side negative, in which economic development is all that matters. The first question we want to ask is, why is it that you only develop or urban plan around economic development, especially when your city center is already up and running? We think that even just as in terms of quality of life improvements, that you should have a responsibility to the people within the region to give them the kinds of hospitals, give them the schools necessary so they can become contributing citizens, but also like don't see them as an investment, just see them as quality of life you should give them at the end of the day. Let's take them at their best case and say that all that matters in this debate is access to more jobs, right? First thing we tell you is that a lot of this is already addressed in status quo. A city center would not be flourishing if there wasn't the airports or the roads or the baseline condominiums that you need in these kinds of cities, right? And that is why, like, if these cities are so viable, it's not, the problems you're trying to create are not a thing, right? Like, but more importantly, even if the government comparatively neglects these city centers compared to the peripheries, we see this is not a problem because the private sector will make up for all of these issues. Because of the fact that the private sector gets so much revenue from the investment and from the employment that they have in these cities, and they will obviously be the ones to create the condominiums, create the private airports, or even the private roads necessary for everyone to access their city. That is not a problem. Compare this to what is inherently lost and unresponded to on affirmative. Just the fact that there are less jobs on negative, right? Sure, you want everyone to have access to jobs, but ultimately, a city center is still limited. There's limited land, there's limited space for investment, etc., right? And because of that, that's why you need to develop the periphery to create all of the opportunities that you want, right? If you how will you employ like the people in the rural centers, right, who also exist in this debate? This is not a debate about experts and like the richest, most competitive graduates, because they will always be catered to the private sector, right? But all of these individuals who might be uneducated or might be unskilled labor in the country, right? They are the ones who are unlocked in their potential when you hire them to construct all of the homes in these new peripheries, construct all of the hospitals and office spaces, and because of that, you give them the capital that is necessary to improve themselves in their very own homes, in their very own urban spaces, right? But lastly, again, they can't just say that this is primarily a debate about labor. This is also about economic stability, right? Firstly, about holistic development and better stability. The issue is that these cities, no matter how strong they are in Shanghai, supply chain crisis or any like shock to the market immediately destabilize the city and ruin the security of the country moving forward. The analysis about the housing crisis that exists in China, right? The fact that there can just be a global pandemic or a global supply chain disruption that makes whatever specialized niche, such as technology or business of a certain city suddenly overnight not generate enough capital for everyone else. That is why we have proper competition with these peripheries. Sure, if they can never outcompete the main megacity, then at the very least, they'll pursue a different niche. They'll pursue things such as innovation instead of just the business, science innovation instead of just the business other sectors do. Perhaps they can even just modernize the agricultural sector, like what we need so badly in the Philippines, because Manila just wants to talk about malls and corporations, when in reality, what we need to focus on is modernizing agriculture so that we can have our higher like crop yields and also improve the quality of life of farmers, right? It's this specialization that makes economies a lot more resistant, makes them a lot more competitive in a global market, and also less prone to disruptions. We think this matters most in developing countries because gentrification itself is a problem that happens most in these developing countries, and therefore, yeah, again, just branching out these economies just make sure that we can sustain all of development, right? This is particularly important in the debate because they still haven't addressed their issue of sustainability. The fact that congestion in a megacity is what slows them down. When all you have are the roads that make it so easy to travel to the megacity, then that's what you have, an oversurplus of people immigrating to that city because they think that they'll be able to get rich there, and because they have no opportunities back home, they would rather die trying than stay in their peripheries at the end of the day, right? This is where you have problems such as a large amount of urban poor, a large amount of slums because people had no place to sleep, and so they had to construct their own informal settlers. This is bad in three ways. Firstly, the government has to waste so much money on welfare of the urban poor in this area, right? The fact that they have to keep cleaning up the streets, cleaning up the streets and paying for the urban poor that moved there because of all of the incentives that they were given beforehand. But secondly, it worsens the prospect of, like foreign investment or the foreign hubs there, right? All of a sudden, land prices drop when there's a large amount of like informal settlers in a region where it's a lot more unsafe because people are pushed to horrible alternatives such as crime, etc. Right? That is what eventually lowers the quality of investment of land prices because less people want to live there. Less corporations think it's a safe place for their laborers and it's a less viable economic opportunity. But also, just lastly, in terms of the success indicators that a lot of foreign investors and corporate investors judge a region by, so just like the purchasing power of your of the citizens of the area, it just overall drops. And so therefore, even the city centers that they have are slowed down and bogged down by everyone congesting it and ruining it at the end of the day. What is the like extension if you don't believe of all of this, right? Why is empowering the people the most important thing at the end of the day? Because in the worst case, we have better accountability and greater public demand if we develop the peripheries, right? The issue as to why the peripheries are not represented in status quo or not empowered financially is because of the fact that there is not a sufficient like educated voter base to hold them accountable there. When you develop the peripheries, right, you just like how the Bronx and Queens were developed, and therefore they have their voice of the people, such as AOC, then their internal niches are much more heard out, right? There are much more opportunities for economic development because you listen to the experts from these peripheries, even like the lower class, more agricultural-based people in these industries who have a lot to contribute to the national scale of the government's economy are a lot better catered to, both on a principled level and for a pragmatic level, so that they can, improve the economy holistically.
I thank second affirmative for that speech. I now invite second negative to continue their team's case. Hear, hear.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you're all good.
You're on mute or talking.
Both worlds in this debate involve governments who want to make the most successful major centre for population in their country. They want to give people places to live and places to work. They want to invest in that because that's in the country's future. That's unchanging on both sides of the house, which is why it was ridiculous when that affirmative team suggested that if you choose the CBD model, you just like ignore the rest of the geography of the places that people live. Obviously, that's not what this debate was about. This debate was about, do you want to force people to work near where they live? Do you want to encourage the development of workplaces for them that is just around the corner next door? Or do you want to provide access that is fair and equitable and efficient to the CBD that provided greater economic growth and opportunities for all? We were the side that did not neglect the peripheries. We were the side that made them the best thing that they could be, which was a safe place to live and send your kids to school while you caught an incredibly quick train into the city to enjoy a beautiful day at the job of your dreams in which you were able to be economically productive, come home happy, come home richer, and enjoy a high quality of life in a town that gave you all the things you needed to live, but didn't necessarily have to give you the things that you needed to work. So the thing to say there is that our plan is not one of neglect. We create places to live on the periphery, and people live there, they don't work there. So some people might, like you might have coffee shops. Obviously, Sydney is an example of a city that right now is sort of considering going towards the 3-city model, and it's ruining the city, right? What happens is that like you've got people that live, or an example would be, you know, like if in South Africa, for example, like, so if you've got people that sort of live in one city, some of the population who live there will run the coffee shops, will run the local grocery market and all of that. But the majority of people hop on the train each day, hop on the clean, green public transport that the government provides, and they go and work somewhere else. And that was a city that was far able to give people what they needed. That was New York City, because the peripheries of New York City, like the Bronx, like Long Island and all of that, are connected by the subway so that the majority of people who live in those outer suburbs can travel into New York City to work in one of the greatest financial markets in the world, to work in the greatest businesses in the world, and to work in an incredibly diverse economy in which lots of people could get jobs. That was better. So importantly, they said, oh, look, we could use all of the capital that comes from the amazing city center and, like, you know, produce a bunch of new cities everywhere else. But the important piece of framing to finalize setup in this debate is that the capital that comes from the city center is dependent on the city centre's economic success. So it necessarily reduces on their side of the house, as they haven't responded to any of Brenda's argumentation about how this is bad for labour markets and prevents economic growth. But secondly, the capital that comes from the city centre and the capital that you have in tax needs to stretch much further, because it reaches less people in a world where people have less mobility, right? I need to build 3 hospitals so that everybody can be in proximity to a hospital in their world, or like I need to build 3 massive malls so that everybody can be in proximity to a large retail center. But in my world, I can build 1 amazing mall and I can build 3 train lines that head into it instead, meaning that I can get more bang for my buck every time I spend money. So then on to the argument of quality of life. They've told you a couple of things. Firstly, they've told you that you can get tourism niches. Secondly, that roads are not cramped because you have a more spread out population. Thirdly, that businesses can have efficient supply chains. Fourthly, that there's more to go around in terms of choice and job opportunity. And finally, that this corrects for the lottery of birth. The first thing I'm going to talk about is how we improve quality of life for individuals. This responds to where that second speaker tells you that we have a responsibility to provide people with living infrastructure like hospitals and schools, and to avoid the harms of people experiencing the urban poor. So the first thing to say is that on their side of the house, they get less hospitals and they get less schools because you are so busy funding and building new CBDs everywhere. The government's main idea is to build like rentable business capital within these new city centers all around the world, and sort of like hoping that that's what happens. On our side of the house, we build public transport, we build schools, and we build livable communities on the periphery of a great city center that is organically developing. So we save a lot of our money there. But in terms of how this impacts individuals, our side of the debate was far more inclusive and corrects for the lottery of birth far more. Because on their side of the debate, the problem of whether or not you are able to get a job always depends on where you live, right? It literally always does. As soon as that periphery city grows in demand, then there's always going to be the people who live closer to it and the people who live further away. So you just have 3 incredibly inequitable cities instead of 1 that a lot of people can access to. So what do I mean like this? The bigger that a city gets, the more public transport routes are built to get into it, right? You get more express services, you get more connecting bus routes that bring people to the closest train station, that bring them to that express service, and you get an increasing proportion of people who come into work via public transport rather than via private transport. That means that it's no matter where you live, if you're like me and you're from the south coast of Australia, but you want to go to university in Sydney and you can want to be a part of the CBD and you want to get a job there, you can afford to live somewhere cheap on the periphery where there is cheap rent because there isn't like a massive thriving market, and then catch the express service every day into the city and have an incredibly high quality of life. On their side of the house, you would need to live close to be able to be a part of that working economy. But there were a couple of other ways that inclusivity was far better on our side of the house. Firstly, we gave people access to non-job related infrastructure that greatly improved their quality of life. What did that look like? Think, in your life, do you just need to go to work? Answer, no. You need to do other things. You need to see specialists. You need to travel to see friends. You need to fall in love. You need to see your family. You need to go to the doctor. You need to buy a new pair of shoes. You need to buy a belt, whatever. So on our side of the house, we give you access to things like the airport, specialists, shopping centers, cultural locations like stadiums and museums where you can go and see Taylor Swift, churches, mosques, places of worship, especially for minorities where there is reduced demand. Like, for example, if If you live in a city where there is an incredibly low, Jewish population, all of you together combined can travel in through the great public transport network that we have to go to the same synagogue. But if you are all in separate cities in which it takes 3 hours to get from one side to the other, you may not ever be able to access a synagogue because you have been split in 3 and there are less of you overall. Finally, we also give you access to things like social movements and LGBTQ plus movements, right? You can connect better with people around your city. You can find a workplace or a church that is friendly to that way of thinking because it is accessible. And it doesn't matter if you're born out in the hills or if you're born in the city, you will be able to get there. And we also give more social mobility to people because we make it possible to make friends, fall in love, and have a colleague who came from an entirely different walk of life than you. The impact of this point is that we allow people to be a part of the dream of working in one of the greatest cities in the world. Your work location shouldn't be owned just by the people who live there. That is inherently unfair on every scale. The quality of life for all of life's activities is better when we have highly mobile and highly developed CBDs that people can get to. We increase equity and we reduce the importance of where you live or the arbitrary nature of whether or not you own land. Finally, then, on the economic growth arguments in this debate, our cities are far more functional, which is better for businesses. They told you cities get bad when they get full. That's true even of periphery CBDs, right? The problem with them is that they can't give somewhere for people to live. They have to try and cram living and working into the same space. We get far less traffic because everybody is expected to catch public transport into work, and we don't get this arbitrary gravity between the 3 cities when someone has to go to the doctor, somebody has to go pick up their kids from school. People get naturally that people start to get employed in other areas, and it creates 2-hour traffic jams between all of the city centers. On our side of the world, there is a clear flow of traffic in and out, and you can just live on the experts. That was much better for businesses because they got more efficient deliveries. They got more integration between their inputs. They got cheaper costs of, sending things from one business to another, which allowed them to build better end products. This was a city that was easier to plan. It was more sustainable and it was more resilient to growth, and everybody had a better life that was fairer and more accessible. We were so proud to support the CBD model.
I think second negative for that speech. I now invite third affirmative to conclude the substantive portion of their team's case. Hear, hear.
Hello, I presume I'm audible and visible.
Yep, you are.
Okay. So same policy as last time. I'll try to keep track of the panel if anyone disconnects. If anyone does disconnect, just let me know via chat. Turn on your cam, turn on your mic. Okay.
Okay, I'll try and do that for you, and you can focus on doing your speech, but I will let you know if there is any disruption.
Yeah, gotcha. Yep, that works. Okay, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Second affirmative is right. It is great to fall in love in a big city with everything falling into pieces for you. But you know what's better? Falling in love in 3 cities, traveling in 3 cities, and optimizing supply chains in 3 cities, which I have never responded to from our speech. We have 2 primary win conditions coming from the side of affirmative. Where do we get better economic growth based on the niches of the market, which I also concede is an important factor? Second, where can we improve the quality of life overall, which is something they clash with us? These are 2 independent passive victories because it proves that the current growth is better, not only for the cities themselves, but also for the peripheries around them. And negative agrees to these 2 main characterizations. Negative takes an incredibly high burden when they promise to improve the quality of life for people via trickle-down mechanism from the government, from private sector, but is overly reliant on these things, which they have never proved as the likely outcome, given they have never proved that the political will is likely to move in their favor overall. Let's first deal with the trade-off that Leah tried to force to us. They said there it is under our side, you have 3 inequitable cities versus 1 inequitable city. I just want to make this very, very clear. It's untrue that we will develop 3 inequitable cities under our side of the house. And the reason for that is because you have independent niches to the supply chains. So for example, if you're one company, for instance, you have to supply to like 3 multiple cities, or you have factories in 3 multiple cities, obviously you'll try your best to be able to optimize these 3 different areas. That's better for you overall. But the second reason as to why this is good, it's necessarily the analysis we gave to you earlier. It's because you don't force all the development into one area, which makes it overly cramped, and you force all individuals to go to one area, into which it becomes very, very hard for transportation, for it to move around, for example. It's not as efficient as well. That's the important, crucial mechanism that they didn't respond to earlier. This is important necessarily because if you cram everything into one city, that doesn't, yes, they might be close to each other, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the transportation by which you're able to move around the city is the most efficient, given everybody there is there to begin with. So sure, you have transportation, you have subway lines, for example, you have huge amounts of highways, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it becomes the most efficient output at the end of the day. But lastly, we would claim that there's no chance for growth on their side of the house because the government believes everything's already in place, is already in peace. But also, it's very hard for you as an urban planner to be able to expand past that big mega city. What this necessarily means is that either they don't expand and they make it much worse off, or they will expand, or if they try to expand, it is the kind of expansion which is as good because number one, there's like a lack of political will to be able to do so. But number two, they never prove as to why this the likely delta to occur, given that the people who live on the margins, as they claim, are the poor individuals. So I'm not exactly sure why the kind of development they get in that end is the best for them under their side of the house. But lastly, you also claim under second negative why the peripheries are better. And we're going to prove to you why it's actually worse off on their side. Number one, we just get this very clear pivot coming from second negative, where they say, we want people to live on the peripheries near the megacity. But in first neg also says, we're okay with them living in the city. So what is it really? Like, which case are we going to try to believe? Are they going to live inside the city, or are they going to live outside the peripheries? But let's engage with this new case shift coming from Leah. If the peripheries are bad, or if they live in the peripheries, why is it necessarily bad? The reason for this is because there's no incentive to develop. They can't affect, there will probably be subway lines, there will be highways that connect to them, but people live far away. It is still generally hard for them to travel toward these urban hubs. Note their own characterization concedes this when they say, we want one hospital, we want one mall where everybody will go to. We would say that's generally not good at all, especially in a time of COVID, for example. So you want everybody to just go to one mall, go to one hospital, hoping that it'll be able to capsize everybody, or be able to contain everybody and be able to give everybody as much efficiency as they want. But we would say that it's far worse off, given the point at which you do that, people become more congested at that point in time. You don't have an overwhelming supply of individuals or doctors, for example, or the capacity for public workers to be able to attend these individuals. I'm not exactly sure as to why building one hospital overall is necessarily able to acquiesce to all the needs of individuals around your area. But then let's deal with the primary case then, therefore, coming from negative. Because first negative asserts that a large labor market is better for 4 structural reasons: innovation, different types of jobs, specialization, mobility overall. Let's respond to this. First on innovation, I think this is just a wash in the debate. Most people fly into Silicon Valley anyway, or to Shenzhen, Guangdong, for instance, to be able to access the Chinese or US tech markets. So it isn't as exclusive. It's actually the workers who actually live near those areas who are the most important actors in the debate. But second, specialization, different types of labor is better because you strap people, or it's worse off on their side of the house, necessarily because you strap people to pursuing only one form of industry within that capital or within that city, for instance. So for example, the tech industry, the commerce industry, or the industrial industry to begin with. Which means that if these individuals who are oftentimes low skilled, don't succeed, then that's necessarily bad because it'll be hard for them to find a new job that's out of their own niche. That's necessarily harmful because then these CBDs develop into a tech center, but if you aren't as techy or you can't get that field, then you have no other alternative. You're going to have to move elsewhere, which doesn't have the same kind of development. At least on our side of the house, we give options for people to be able to switch jobs when it's necessary for them to be able to do so. That engages to why specialization and different forms of jobs are better. Under our side of the house, we win under comparative and their standard. Lastly, they talk about mobility, and this is the primary win condition that their case is based upon. If I prove that mobility and transportation is worse off on their side, we win. There's 3 independent paths as to why we win this. One, we're going to prove to you why transportation is not ultimately the tipping factor. But second, we're going to prove why we get better, and third, why they make it worse off. First, why is it not the tipping factor, even if you don't buy the 2 responses later on? Number one, each city under our side of the house has its own niche. Therefore, there wouldn't be a reason for you to necessarily go out of that city, be able to find another job later on, necessarily because that city itself is able to provide you what you necessarily need within that city. But in the worst case scenario, where you do have to move out, there are other alternatives for you to be able to explore. You lack that alternative under the side of negative when you force everybody to specialize under their side of the house, necessarily because they aren't, or necessarily because you lack the expertise to be able to do that, because you lack education structures, you lack structure for government and political will to be able to do so, which we told you was exclusive under our side. No response from these from like the two negative speakers. Udai can't come here and bring to you the new response, as to why they like to have a new mechanism under his under their third speech. But lastly, we told you as to why it is crucial under our side of the house, because then companies are necessarily able to create commerce hubs that increases their commercial necessity and efficiency. This is worse off under the side of negative, because governments on their side of the house can just dump one transportation network in this CBD and say, okay, we're done with it. It's very hard for you then, therefore, to be able to get political will to be able to improve it if more and more people come in, for two reasons. One, you're just lacking out the space. I'm not exactly sure why under negative. They believe if you have infinite space that can keep reaching out over and over again. We told you multiple structural reasons as to why it's very hard for you to expand. But second, I'm generally unsure as to why there's government will for you to necessarily be able to expand. If government structures are always buying into the rich, for example, as they claim it to be, then if the rich are already protected within that CBD, I'm unsure as to why the government has any political will to be able to expand. The important delta here is that if the government is bad on both sides of the house, we at least have a tipping point for government to care under our side, necessarily because each city under our side is a voter hub in and of itself. The reason as to why AOC won the Bronx and the Queens, for instance, in 2018 was necessarily because she was able to cater to one voter hub specifically in that area. The point at which we make governments care about these cities, the point at which you get more political will, because these cities actually voter hub, no response from the side of negative, which ultimately means that even if you do believe negative's primary win condition that they get better transportation, that doesn't necessarily mean that the quality of life increases overall. In fact, they make it much worse off. They never prove the trickle down under their side of the house. But why is he weighing here? We have a couple mechanisms. One, on government subsidies to care, we told you as to why there'll be more care because there's larger government will, which goes towards second win condition, which is the quality of life. We told you why we have marginally more space. So even if they're able to get more efficiency, that doesn't necessarily tell us why you're like you as a person within that own space is much better off, especially when it becomes more cramped. Everybody's using the same kind of infrastructure, using the same kind of public transportation overall. But lastly, we told you as to why development and competition is far worse off on your side, because you strangle it only towards the richest of the rich, and there's no incentive to go down to the poorest of the poor overall. We told you why this is the most likely effect on the other side of the house, because you punish people on their side for the pure reason of their birth lottery, and you don't create any holistic development, and you lack government accountability structures to be able to fix it. Very proud to affirm.
I thank third affirmative for that speech. I now invite third negative to conclude the substantive portion of the debate. Hear.
Cool. Can I be heard?
Yep, you can.
The vast majority of people do not have a choice as to where they live. They're locked out of that choice by things like cost, which is why they often live on the periphery. When you consider that fact, the question the panel must ask is very simple. Should you restrict the access of these people who live in the periphery to only that periphery in the hopes that maybe side affirmative is able to improve somewhat the quality of that periphery? Or do you unlock the connections that unshackle these people and allow them to access the entire set of resources that the large megacity near them provides? The answer is obvious. Two things I'll address in this speech. Firstly, why we win on the most important issue, that of labor markets, and then secondly, why we also win on the issue of amenities. Let's start by addressing the issue of labor markets, because what we explain here is very simple, that when you integrate the periphery into the city, you produce a larger labor market. Larger labor markets are always better and more productive than smaller ones, so that is necessarily the thing that you should do. We get 3 responses down the bench to this claim. The first thing we hear is like, yeah, that's true, but the city is full, so you can't integrate more things into it. We point out that cities aren't buckets, they're living organisms. The idea that a city could just be full doesn't make much sense. For example, you can always just build upwards and increase the density in the center of the city in order to have more office space. You could do things like expand outwards. We'd note that the cores of many cities grow bigger over time. For example, like in New York, Manhattan, the entirety of that island is now kind of the CBD of that city. That is obviously something that most cities have a capacity to do. Thirdly, we say that you could engage in things like redevelopment that obviously give you more room. We receive no credible response to this. Secondly, they say, well, the problem with peripheral cities right now is just that there's been insufficient investment. If we invested a lot of money, they could also be thriving, valuable cities. We have a number of questions here. The first one is just that we suggest governments often don't have the expertise to know how to invest in these cities, because they just assume government invests, then you have this like tech niche satellite city that exists outside your mega city. I think there's some analysis missing there. How is it that the government knows what niche needs to be in that city and which one companies will respond to? What kinds of infrastructure they're building to attract that particular niche? Where are the specialized workers who niche, industries require coming from? We point out the vast majority of people who live in these peripheral cities tend to be low-skilled workers. They just assume you can build like Shenzhen outside a city. No analysis given as to how that is. But we point out that even in the instance that it is true that you invest in these cities, the incentives they point to for companies to move there are insufficient. They say the land is cheaper and often you have untapped labor, or we could grant things like tax breaks. We say that even then, companies are unlikely to invest in these areas. Why? Because the labor pool is not deep enough, because there's often insufficiently skilled workers, because you can't operate at the kind of scales that you can within the city. We say that their incentives are insufficient to stack up against the 4 reasons we give you and that they do not respond to as to why cities, which are larger labor markets, will always win out. The fact that you agglomerate far more people together, which means that you have a much larger labor market, which also means that secondly, you have economies of scale. So for example, instead of building one small factory in the periphery of the city, you build a very large factory in the center of the city that would make goods for far cheaper costs, and therefore would more than make up for the fact that the land or the labor might be a bit more expensive inside that city. We also point out that if you need specialized skilled workers, which many industries often do, you're far more likely to be able to find them within the confines of a very large city labor market than within the confines of a very small peripheral city labor market. Finally, we explain to you that because we give people access to more jobs, we allow them to trade up and sort of access better jobs in all of those instances. They don't have sufficient response. They just tell us things about how, well, there'd be some transport on either side, ignoring that obviously the debate requires there to be a comparative and a difference in terms of those things. The final thing is just to say that, well, even if these people had access to the city, how would they ever outcompete all the rich people who live in that city? Which just ignores the way that labor markets operate. We're not claiming that if you live in the periphery, you're suddenly going to become like the biggest investment banker and outcompete everyone there. We point out that economies grow. When you add more people to them, the economy expands and new jobs are created because you also have new consumers as part of that labor market now, which grows the demand for various types of employment. We say that even if they aren't beating out the people who live in that city, the jobs they get in that area are just far better than the ones that would get outside. And the reason for that is simple. It's because cities are more productive. It means there's more money left over to pay each worker, and there's more profit to attract the kind of investment you need. You can think about, for example, even a very low-skilled job, like if you work as a cashier at a store, produces more value in the city than it does outside it because you get far more customers in the city. So you're doing more, you're producing more value for your employer. You can be paid more. Your employer can invest more in that particular industry, which is exactly why we get far ahead of them here. The final Hail Mary is just to point to a series of examples like New York and South Africa, which we point out should be credibility destroying for this team because they're huge examples for our side. Firstly, we point out that New York is a city where the vast majority of people work in Manhattan. They live in the periphery areas like Bronx, like Queens, like Brooklyn, etc., to access the labor market of Manhattan. That is exactly what we would do on our side. This team would have them not be able to access Manhattan and have to work in those areas, which would make them significantly poorer. They then talk about South Africa, which we point out has the highest unemployment rate of any middle-income country, exact proof that these satellite cities just trap people and do not work at all. The impact of this argument is huge, though, because it explains why like we explained to you that this is incredibly important. Like whether or not you access a job means whether or not you can support yourself. On their side, you have more unemployment. You have more of the urban poor and the slums that they talk about. You have people who rely on welfare or in many instances starve. We explained that even on the margins, getting access to a better job that pays $1 an hour extra has massive implications for quality of life that far outweigh anything else in the debate, which is why we must win. But let's secondly address the issue of amenities, which is where we win the debate again. We point to a number of things that receive literally no response that have to witness this issue outright. Firstly, we talk about things like community building. We say that, for example, if you're queer or if you're from a racial minority or from some other minority group, it might be very useful that you have very good access to the large set of population in the city so you can meet similar people to you who hold your beliefs. You might be able to access a church better that might not exist in the periphery. You might be able to join a social circle that shares your interests. Or you might be able to access types of support that you're very unlikely to be able to do on their side. We say because where you live is often determined by things like price, it's often that the fact that you live in places where the people around you aren't similar to you, where often you don't feel a sense of community. We give you access to that. They have no response for how they would do any of those things. Their only claim on this issue is just to say, well, in New York, they elected AOC, which means people have a voice, which is a non sequitur in this debate for the reason that people in the periphery get to vote on both sides and would obviously vote for politicians who share their interests on both sides. They provide no analysis as to why this is in any way distinct. We stack up the margin here with a number of additional arguments. We point out that even if the peripheries are developed as per their best case scenario, they will never be as developed as a city, which is why it's very crucial you have access to that city. Because, for example, many of the services you need will be things that can never exist in periphery. Periphery will never have an airport. The periphery is very unlikely to have specialized doctors who many people are likely to need access to. It's very unlikely to have all of those services. But even to the extent that it does, that requires duplication. That means that there's less money overall to spend. So services would be of a lower quality both in the city and in the periphery than if you just built it once and gave everyone better access to it, which is what we do on our side. They say that you have problems like congestion, but we point out that urban sprawl that they must support leads to more congestion when everyone has to drive everywhere. Then on our side, we can have high-speed rail that gets everyone into the city center, which is walkable and doesn't require those kinds of things. They talk a lot about sustainability, but we point out that they are the unsustainable side, because when everyone is unemployed in the periphery, there's no tax revenue to support any of the development or infrastructure that they rely upon. At the end of this debate, the team that wins is negative for the reason that we give people choice and mobility, and they fail to do so.
I thank the third negative speaker for that speech. I now invite Neg Reply to begin the reply portion of the debate. Hear.
Hey, just one moment while I get my timer in place. Now, also, can I be heard?
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. Ready to go. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1. I want to start this reply by being as charitable as possible to side affirmative. So let's assume, but not concede, that it is true the governments could successfully develop satellite cities that, as second affirmative tells you, maybe aren't as big as the main CBD, but still function economically and have some access to jobs. It's here that the material given to you at second negative becomes debate winning in this debate. Because people don't just need to get to work, they have a diverse set of needs that often require them to crisscross the city. They have lives and families in other parts of the city. They need to see specialist doctors who are unlikely to live in the periphery. They often just want to access the fun and nightlife that a city can offer. And because small cities can't have literally everything that everyone who lives there needs, is much harder on their side to access them because this team on the affirmative does not prioritize building the public transport required to get them access to those things. And the implication of that in this adjudication is even if the other side prove that they can help people get some access to jobs, people who live in the peripheries would clearly prefer to live in a city where they can get around easily than where a job just happens to be particularly close for them. It's always better for governments to help people on the periphery move inwards, even if this occurs imperfectly, even if governments don't invest in public transport perfectly, even if there is still some congestion, if there's underinvestment in the periphery, even if all of those things inside affirmative claim are true, the reason people move to the periphery is because they want access to the city itself. Side negative better respects that preference, which is precisely why side negative are going to take the round, regardless of what you believe about the side affirmative case. But let's now examine that case a touch more critically, because both sides agree, and side negative in particular tell you at first, labour markets determine people's welfare. Whether having a job and having a good job are the crucial determinants of especially low-income people in being happy and being able to act in their lives with agency. And side affirmative, as a starting step, they have to prove they get better economic growth and better labour market outcomes for those people, because otherwise they literally cannot win the debate. It's a necessary condition of victory for them. And what they say here that all that's required is for governments to invest a little and that companies will follow. And the problem for this affirmative team is a problem of characterization. Because side negative explain crucially and in a manner that is just not responded to at all sufficiently, that the model of economic development that side affirmative point to is an extremely misguided one. They say that companies will want to move to these areas and create niches and not point to land and not compete for land. And then they point to examples that are actually examples for side negative. The example of New York, where Manhattan built upwards and they built the subways to get access to it. And that is why large companies like Amazon want to move there, because that is the place people want to live. That is the place where they have the greatest access to a diverse set of labor. They say, oh, we want these places to become diversified. But side negative explain that it's only by having a large interconnected labor market that you get specialization and diversification. They say they want these companies to set up and help people get better jobs. We explain that the ability of having mobility, not being so tied to, not having your job tied so directly to where you live, and your ability to threaten to leave that job in order for a better job across the city is one, the way that to force companies to pay workers better and try and improve their conditions, and two, allows workers to just leave for better jobs or jobs that they prefer or move and be able to study in different parts of the city, which definitionally smaller cities can't have literally everything these people need, which means they can't get that. That material in particular about mobility receives nothing but the barest and most sort of misguided response at third affirmative, where they try and explain we wouldn't have the public transport necessary, but under either side, it's just far more likely that a government that prioritizes giving people in the periphery access to the middle will get them better jobs, get them the jobs they need, and allow them to move between jobs, because no one has the same job for a long period of time. No matter what you believe about the affirmative case, they lose. Incredibly proud to oppose.
I thank Neg Reply for that speech. I now invite AF Reply to conclude the debate. Hear, hear.
Hello, sorry, wonky setup. Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Sorry to ruin a storyline about the rematch from last year, but those don't matter right now. Look at your notes and see why we need to proceed. The first thing you need to look at is how unfair their pivoting of their case has been. The case shift from first to second was this. First said that their peripheries are basically a slum. No one wants to work there. It sucks. You need to develop these places. This is what he told you. You need to develop these places because they ruin prospects of economic development otherwise. You have to pay for welfare of these peripheries and you need to clean it up because foreign investors will think your country sucks when they see these things, right? The extent to which they resolve this problem in the rest of the debate is to say that, oh, we just need to make good subways so that tourists and then they can just travel to the cities. Amazing. No response to how these people need the opportunities or the education to get those jobs. Never mind the fact that there are not enough jobs to cater to them. Even if the subways will transport them to the city, all they'll see there is just a slum because they have no job to move into, right? You never respond to this. It means that we are winning on the rural poor. And since we told you that this can outweigh whatever development happens in the city center, that's an independent path to victory. Second neg and third neg try to pivot the case and say, no, we just want everyone to be in different niches. First call out, right? The only time that they build the niche or the development that they get in peripheries is at third negative. And you can't credit this. That's the first time they said economies of scale and how you'll still try to develop these areas. Before that, all that they said was they want to transport laborers from the peripheries to the cities, right? But even if you credit the whole third neg speech, two reasons why we still win, right? The best responses of third neg still assumes that these areas suck and that they will always be poor. No response or preventive framing at the top where we told you we have the capital to give corporations the tax breaks necessary to jumpstart the periphery. We'll get the experts that will trailblaze development in these areas, right? And that in itself like still shields us from all of their worst harms. But most importantly, right, the unresponded mechanisms in the rest of the issues give us additional paths to victory, which we'll talk about right now. Comparatively, there's always some level of access to the cities on their side. The difference on the debate then is how the peripherals are better helped, right? First issue, first clash, where is urban planning more feasible? Because their first path to victory is to say, oh, it's just a lot cheaper and easier. We told you, no, it's not actually a lot easier, right? Even if the periphery sucks, there will be enough incentives to move in here, right? As long as you give the initial investment. We told you about how you generate political will for all the people who want to develop. We told you about different niches that these peripheries, which may be undeveloped, may have, like agriculture, but they still have large amounts of selling points to the larger economy in terms of the stability or like the diversity of a country's economy. And we told you about first movers advantage that would make it so that companies want to capitalize on just the geographic proximity to the city or the fact that there is a large demand that is currently uncatered to in the city, right? Comparatively, you are not able to change how city centers are always congested, right? Urban planning is so hard, even if you try to do it, because firstly, governments don't really understand. No response to how we told you that governments get complacent because this is a bustling city center. But secondly, even if Udai says we need to have a comparative, sure, we have one. We told you that the private sector will do all of the good things that you want, they draw their capital and workforce for these city centers, so they'll create whatever kinds of big roads and airports that you want. What governments will not do, however, is be able to resolve the existential flaws of a city center. The fact that if it is so good, then it is so full. Land is finite. The spaces for corporate investment is finite, right? And the space in a synagogue that everyone wants to visit is finite. And so what happens on your side is that the city centers get worse. All of the development and solutions you want to implement come at the cost of more congestion, which is not weighed at all in the debate, and we weighed as the most important thing, right? The fact that no matter how much you optimize public transport, if everyone wants to go there, it'll stay dirty and stay congested, and that no matter how good you make the development of the hub, right, there will not be enough jobs for people. There will be too much gentrification to lock people out, right? Their only response to this is to say periphery cities will become congested too. But we tell you simply, the same demand exists, but the supply changes. If there's 3 cities catering to everyone who wants development, by basic math, we cater to more people, right? But the key weighing at the end of this is, even if we have to have more spending, it just has what make more greater returns. Their last line of response is just to say that, oh, why not just have one
Sorry,
mall?
your time is
Because 3 malls
expired.
generates so much more capital. It helps more people and it gets more development. We clearly win. Thanks.
Cool. I thank all speakers for that debate. Congratulations once again for getting as far as you have. That is really epic. I will stop the recording now. How do I do that?